Yeah, thanks, Sue. And good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I want to focus today on development tools. We've spent a bit of time over the last 5 weeks. We've talked about how it is that people learn, how it is that they come to have growth needs. We talked about growth needs strength. We then went on to talk about the processes of development. And ultimately, last week, we had a look at the process of development, the actual mechanics of doing planning development for an organization of about 50 people, and looked at the competency framework for that type of organization. And it's right now that we come to the end and we say, okay, that's all fine. We've done all this management stuff, but what tools are we going to use? How are we going to actually go about doing the development? And we've got to then visit the subject of doing something for a purpose. And what we do is oriented completely around that purpose. What we're trying to get away from here is don't ever send anybody on a training course. Don't ever sit somebody down in front of Linda and some videos and say, get on and watch those videos. Unless, of course, those are appropriate interventions, appropriate training, appropriate development for that person, that activity, and what you're hoping to get out of it. So without more ado, let's go through some of the slides, and we'll talk a bit about the development tools. And we will, if I can manage to organize the technology. Right. Okay, this is a little bit of an introduction at the end, if you like. This is what we're going to end with. And it's going to show us that perhaps in 5 broad headings, there are a series of tools. There are a series of what I'm going to call interventions. And an intervention, a very important word, we'll come back to it. Intervention is literally, because we don't want to get tied into going on a training course or watching a video, we want to talk not about training, but about somehow intervening in the person's life to cause a change. And we'll come back to that. So we're talking a lot about changing a person's behavior, changing their competencies in order to contribute to changing their behavior. Ultimately, what we're looking for is a change in the firm, the organization's capability. And we'll come back to this one again, and you'll get a chance to look at some of those in more detail. Now, we've got to come to, first of all, how do we know we need to do something? Well, many of you will have come along through the trimester 1, which talks about how we actually manage people, and we'll have looked at this idea of the feedback control loop coming from systems engineering, the feedback control loop that says, I have something I want to achieve, and I've called it here the reference performance. We want the reference performance. That's what we'll be happy if we get. The person is going to give us actual performance. Now, if the actual performance is equal to the reference performance, we're going to be happy. Of course, if the actual performance is above the reference performance, we're even more happy. But in principle, we're happy if the actual performance is higher than the reference performance. If, of course, it's not, then in good systems engineering terms, it goes into the comparator in the manager's mind, and the manager says, not happy about this. And that creates this thing called an error. And the error, the bigger the error, the bigger the deviation between the actual and the reference, the bigger the error. And therefore, that drives us into what intervention are we going to use? We're going to build some kind of intervention. And you'll see there, I've said, well, the presumption is we've actually got an intervention repertoire. We've got a bunch of interventions that we already have, that we know we can use. And then we apply those. And here comes what we're looking for. We're looking for a change. And Sue introduced the idea of a plant and growing a plant and developing a plant along. Well, it's the same, a similar analogy here. You take a plant, if its leaves are dropping, performance down. If its leaves are dropping, do you water it? Well, maybe, but if you water some plants, they'll drop even more leaves. And you might find out ultimately that you didn't need to do anything other than remove the plant from the draft it was in, change the environment. So we have to be quite clear about what we're going to try and achieve, why the actual performance is down, why we're not seeing that, and therefore which intervention are we going to select for the corrective action. And of course, this is a lot also about, if we're going to develop for an unknown future, we're trying to develop skills, then we've got to be quite careful about that reference performance. That reference performance might be something we're projecting forward into the future. Now, here's a young lady here involved in a bit of electronics. And we talked 2 or 3 weeks ago about growth needs strength quite at length. And growth needs strength, the need to grow, the growth motivation, the desire to learn, as opposed to the desire to achieve. And we looked at the idea that some people were achievement oriented and some people are growth oriented. Of course, there's no point in giving somebody an intervention that is growth oriented, where in fact they are achievement oriented in their own outlook. So we have to again be quite careful of what we're doing. But people learn through rote. We understand that because of the way, for example, the Koreans and the Chinese will tend to learn things by repeating them back. And we'll look at a minute about that. But people learn by rote, they learn by simply repeating. Socially, trial and error, of course. This young lady may be involved here in a bit of trial and error. Rehearsal and practice. Understanding, it's likely this young lady is involved certainly in some understanding, likely to be some learning. You don't just dive into this sort of stuff from the very beginning. You don't just learn it by trial and error. You learn by understanding, then perhaps by trial and error. And of course, the one I like is through models, because we are mostly learned through mental models. So we have to be careful that we match the intervention to the person who's the, if you like, the victim, the beneficiary, shall we say, of the intervention. Now, we also have to understand what we're trying to achieve. And here's a hierarchy. At the bottom of the hierarchy, you've got that we want somebody to recall facts, to remember. The next level up is, which will take more energy and more effort, is to understand. Above that, they have to apply. So you can imagine here that you remember, understand, and apply. Many, many trades, many jobs stop there. We don't require them to go any further. They have to do what they've been taught to do. The next one up, and even more energy, and of course, depending on the type of person, it has to be targeted at the individual who is in the job, which requires them to analyze. But to analyze, evaluate, and create, that's, if you like, a slightly different ballgame, because we're having to encourage people through intervention to analyze, teach them the tools of analysis, teach them the tools of evaluation, and then ultimately teach them to be creative. And you can imagine there that if all we're doing is teaching facts, remembering, then we're not going to expect somebody to be creative. We have to know where we're at on this hierarchy. Otherwise, what we're trying to do will fail. We also have to think right at the beginning about how we're going to evaluate. Now, the classic evaluation is reaction. They're called in the trade happy sheets. You know, you end up going at the end of the course, you fill in a happy sheet. Did you like the course? And you say, yeah, it was really good, and you make some comments. The value of that is limited. It tells you only that they enjoyed it, the trainees enjoyed it. Above that is learning, to what extent did those who are the trainees learn. And above that, the real one where we're starting to be interested in is, did we see the behavior change that we wanted? Did we teach those competencies such that they changed their behavior? And the one above that, ultimately, of course, taking longer in time, is, did we see the business impact as a result of that training? And that takes longer to do. So there we are. Some comments there about targeting the intervention to the goal required and the individual and the needs of the individual. So that leaves us with a bit of a process. You've got the first running through in numerical sequence. Number one, What are you trying to do? What's the performance that's to be changed? Number two, how am I going to measure it? Not wait until the end, but how am I going to measure it? What changes in behavior will I be happy with, will actually mark the change? And then, of course, 4A and B, what knowledge and skills and what environment as an alternative. We always have to remember that 4B is an option. We don't just blindly say we have to train. There are other options. And if you've been on some of the other webinars about balance between technology and human competence, then of course, you would expect that we could change the technology. And this, of course, is a huge debate about robots took my job, etc. The balance between those. But we don't have to train. We don't have to develop. We can do other things. Then the question, is development the solution? Well, if it is, great, do it and then measure it. But if it's not, then don't be frightened to go around the houses again and say, well, you know, development's not the solution, so what is? And that gives you a bit of a process there. And ultimately, you're going to go back and say, am I getting the performance I want? Am I getting the change? That brings us to where we came in, which is the interventions. What I want to do is to just give you some example interventions and show you the sort of thing that we might be looking at. But broadly, we've got 5 headings: the traditional training course thing, the self-directed stuff, reading a book. People argue, oh, you never read anything from a book. Of course you do. If that's targeted at you, and that is something that you are minded to read and minded to challenge and analyze, then the book may be just the thing you want. Through into effective instruction, people teaching, through computer-based. Computer-based is naturally, these days, we assume that because you can do it with a computer, therefore you have to do it. No, not necessarily. We have to target, we have to be sure that that's going to work for us. And then finally, the simulated work, and we'll look at that in the example. But the point here is that there are different types. A word here about coaching and mentoring, because I would also put them in. They're a form of intervention, as is incidentally changing a person's job role. If you second them to some other department, that is probably the right environment for the right person. That is as effective as teaching them something through some traditional method. So that's why it's terribly important that we don't talk about training and tools. We talk about, although I've used it there as the title, we're talking here about interventions. A word about coaching and mentoring. Coaching is where there is no net inflows, no inflow from the coach to the coachee, to the person being developed. The assumption in coaching is that the person being developed has got all the competency that they need. They just need it awakening. And coaching techniques awaken latent competency. Whereas mentoring it includes that, but it also includes the fact that the mentor will be a peer and probably more knowledgeable than the person being developed, and that there is actually therefore the mentor has something to say on the subject and is perhaps a subject matter expert in themselves. So quite different things there using coaching and mentoring. So let's just have a look then at some of these development tools and just talk a little bit about what each one is and what benefit it has. Now, I'll go first to the self-directed. Now, this is more the sort of book and academic paper. If I take, we here are developing, and it's a big activity of Sue's, to develop general mental ability testing and psychometric testing, and to build tools for those. Now, the thing about that is nobody tells her what to do. Nobody instructs her. It's a case of understanding the notice, the underlying theory, understanding how, and perhaps learning how to build tools in general, and then applying it. And you'll see here, this is just a paper. I've just highlighted an academic paper. It's been published in Human Performance, volume 15. And it is entitled Cognitive and GMA Testing in the European Community, by two academics, Salgado and Anderson. And that is quite a landmark paper. So we'd be looking at that to give input to those general mental ability GMA testing tools. And so there's the idea of self-directing. And of course, that's terribly important in innovation, where you don't get taught to the innovation. You uncover, you explore in order to innovate an invention and creation. So that's the self-directed learning from the likes of academic papers and books. You've then got the computer-based. Now, the computer-based is classic of things. This is actually a little thing from the call center training, where you can imagine that the call center operative is making, you'll see by the $sign there, it's an American thing, is making a call, and you're trying to teach somebody the ins and outs of making a call, and how to make the call, and things to say, things not to say, and the likes. And I'll just let this run, and we'll see how it comes out. It should be okay.
Account information before the call begins. This account information lays a foundation for the call. You will have access to this information throughout the conversation. Once you're ready to start the conversation, click the You Say button. Then, read through the responses and choose the most appropriate answer. In some cases, there may be more than one appropriate way to respond to the consumer. However, you must choose the best answer. After each response, you will receive coach feedback. This feedback will let you know if you choose the best answer. If you did not choose the best answer, he will give you tips and advice on how to respond to the consumer going forward. Another useful tool is the Consumer Thinks button. This allows...
Yeah, so you see the idea there, where you're effectively using the tool that the call center operative is going to work with, but using that tool as a device to train and to tease out ideas about what should you say at this point in time, what should you say at that point in time. And you see the idea there of the three choices and the feedback, the dynamic feedback on each choice. And this is perfect for somebody who's in a repetitive job, requires to learn these things, requires to get experience, and can of course go back and retake this again and again, and can then go on to a real life call center situation, try it, and then come back and rerun this. So ideal and very, very simple to put together. Very simple. I mean, I'm using the same kind of idea here, just flicking back and forwards on the presentation. That's all this type of thing does, and there are plenty of applications that will do that. And of course, it's straightforward to put together. Let's just have another look at another one. Now, this one is, I won't click it straight away. I'll just give you a little bit of an input. When you're training in areas where experience is essential, so for example, to experience heat, experience perhaps extremes of environment before you get put in that environment. And this is the classic kind of, we've all seen the military training where people are crawling underneath barbed wire and being with bullets going over the head. They're experiencing an element of what it will be like. It's also important, even when you're using things like computer-based training, where you've got, in world that was associated with in some time ago, which is electronic warfare, the ability to ask what if, the ability to stop the scenario and look at what if, the ability to then talk to subject matter experts, and then to come back to the environment. So let's just have a quick look at this. The music's a bit weird, but it should get the message over. Yeah, so there we are. That's the idea there that you're using. In this case, it's a kind of a snapshot of the environment that people might find themselves in. And again, you can repeat, you can go back through it, you can fail at one point and retry, you can play the what if, but of course you can also do the whole thing, and there's some amazing tank entry. Tank entry is a big issue. If you're, because it's a very unsafe environment. If you're going to enter an environment where you don't know the conditions behind a door, then what do you do? And there's a lot of stuff on computer-based, so turning that into a computer-based training, and all again relatively simple to create, relatively straightforward, but again targeted to what is needed. So let's just go back and look at the last one. Now this one is, let's just get it up for a moment. There's another area, of course, in management training where you're particularly interested in being in situations, being in well, not you being in uncomfortable situations, but understanding very uncomfortable situations such that when you come to deal with it, you are in a very good position. And one area of intervention, one area of training experience is the staged theatre. And what we've got here is a couple of actors acting out something. You'll see it's, you know, more managers would say, oh no, I'd never do that. I'd never do that. But most managers would say, yeah, I've had some kind of experience of that in the past. Maybe not quite as dramatic, maybe even more dramatic, and you'll see what I mean. But stage theatre, role play, these are, nobody likes role play. That's one of the problems. Nobody likes role play. So stage theatre is quite a good thing where you get actors to do things. And in fact, if stage theatre is taken to the limit, you can stop the action and ask the audience, ask the managers who are there as trainees, ask them what should happen now. Then the actors will pick it up again and they'll run off with it and act it. And then you stop, etc. So the idea of stage theatre, role play, and the likes, again with some relevance for specifics. So let's just have a look at this.
If they don't pay, there's not any money for wages, including yours.
I was very busy last week. I mean, you know yourself, Louise was off. She was off sick. I had to answer the phones. Yeah. I was doing 2 jobs. You know I was. How can I do all that work of 2 people and get all the...
We're all busy, but it's not the first time this happened, Carol, is it?
But I had to cover. I was doing 2 jobs last week. You know I was doing 2 jobs. I was covering for her, doing her work and my work. Yeah, okay, maybe 1 or 2 slipped through the net.
Well,
sounds as though...
All I'm asking you to do is do your job. Do the job that you paid.
Well, are you saying I'm not doing my job properly?
Well, I'm saying that if everybody did the job like you did, we'd be in a lot of trouble.
This is just awful. This is... Why are you picking on me? I'm really upset about it, Nick.
Well, I just needed to do...
Yeah, etc. So you get the idea there. How crass can you be? But there we are. And of course, the idea that the trainees in this particular case would talk about what happened and talk about the whole environment and the way it was set up and whether Nick was right to do what he's doing, even into the room layout. There's clearly a desk between the 2. You can't see that, but if you saw the rest of the conversation, you'd see a desk. So you're even able to go in and explore and discuss the room layout and how that might affect the communications. So that gives you a kind of idea of some of the options that you've got. We've selected a few examples there, and I tried to be quite extreme where you're looking at the one hand computer-based training, which is pretty simply assembled. There are plenty, there are actually plenty of tools on it for standard things like, writing reports in Word. You can go and get a computer-based training for that. The important thing there is that you can repeat it, you can read it, get it. You can even be marked on it, of course. And we know many instances, of course, where you get marked on these things. If you don't get so many marks, you're invited to go back to the beginning. You're also able to repeat it, try it at work, come back to it. The simulator. Pilot simulators, aircraft simulators, of course, are fundamental because you can't give a pilot a real live aircraft as a real live 737 and say, off you go. You can't do it. You can't do trial and error with a pilot. So you do trial and error in the simulator. And the same, as I say, with electronic warfare. So that's got great value. The simulator has great value in the what ifs. And then, of course, the traditional manager training where you're dealing with difficult conversations. And in that case, it was role play and theater. So some examples, but hopefully if you take nothing else away from this, if you take nothing else away, it is that interventions, not training, not courses, interventions should be designed for the purpose and outcomes intended. And that's the single takeaway. Interventions, design them for what's required. First of all, of course, you have to determine what is required, design them for what's required, and get on and do it. And know why you're doing it and design what. It's not about sending somebody on a course. It's not about parking them in front of a Linda video. It's about determining the change that's needed and developing for that. And with that, back to Sue.